The 1947–48 civil war in Mandatory Palestine was the first phase of the 1948 Palestine War. It broke out after the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted a resolution on 29 November 1947 recommending the adoption of the Partition Plan for Palestine. When the British Mandate of Palestine expired on 14 May 1948, and with the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, the surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Transjordan, Iraq and Syria, invaded what had just ceased to be Mandatory Palestine, and immediately attacked Israeli forces and several Jewish settlements. The conflict then turned into the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. During the Civil War, the Jewish and Arab communities of Palestine clashed while the British, who had the obligation to maintain order, organized the withdrawal and intervened only on an occasional basis. Background: under the control of a British administration since 1920, the area of Palestine found itself the object of a battle between Jewish Zionist nationalists and Palestinian Arab nationalists, who opposed one another just as much as they both opposed the British Mandate. The Palestinian Arab backlash culminated in the 1936–1939 Arab Revolt in Palestine, directed by Palestinian Arab nationalists. The rebels opposed Zionism, the British presence in Palestine, and Palestinian Arab politicians who called for pan-Arabic nationalism at the same time. Both the British and the Zionist organizations of the time opposed the revolt. Nonetheless, the Palestinian Arab nationalists did obtain from the British a drastic reduction of Jewish immigration, legislated by the 1939 White Paper. However, the consequences of the unsuccessful uprising were heavy. Nearly 5,000 Arabs and 500 Jews died. The various paramilitary Zionist organizations were reinforced, and the majority of the members of the Palestinian Arab political elite exiled themselves, such as Mohammed Amin al-Husseini, leader of the Arab Higher Committee. After World War II and the Holocaust, the Zionist movement gained attention and sympathy. In Mandatory Palestine, Zionist groups fought against the British occupation. In the 2.5 years from 1945 to June 1947, British law enforcement forces lost 103 dead and sustained 391 wounded from Jewish militants. The Palestinian Arab nationalists reorganized themselves, but their organization remained inferior to that of the Zionists. Nevertheless, the weakening of the colonial British Empire reinforced Arab countries and the Arab League. The Haganah was initially involved in the post-war attacks against the British in Palestine but withdrew following the outrage caused by the 1946 airgun bombing of the British Army headquarters in the King David Hotel. In May 1946, on the assumption of British neutrality in the future hostilities, a Plan C was formulated that envisaged guidelines for retaliation if and when Palestinian Arab attacks took place on the Yishuv. As the countdown ticked down, the Haganah implemented assaults involving the torching and demolition by explosives against economic infrastructures, the property of Palestinian politicians and military commanders, villages, town neighborhoods, houses and farms that were deemed to be bases used by inciters and their accomplices. The killing of armed irregulars and adult males was also foreseen. On 15 August 1947, on suspicion it was a terrorist headquarters, they blew up the house of the Abu Laban family, prosperous Palestinian orange growers, near Petah Tikva. 12 occupants, including a woman and 6 children, were killed. After November 1947, the dynamiting of houses formed a key component of most Haganah retaliatory strikes. Diplomacy failed to reconcile the different points of view concerning the future of Palestine. On the 18th of February 1947, the British announced the withdrawal from the region. Later that year, on the 29th of November, the General Assembly of the United Nations voted to recommend the adoption and implementation of the Partition Plan with the support of the big, global powers, but not of Britain or of the Arab states. Beginning of the Civil War. In the aftermath of the adoption of Resolution 181 by the General Assembly of the United Nations recommending the adoption and implementation of the Plan of Partition, the manifestations of joy of the Jewish community were counterbalanced by protests by Arabs throughout the country, and after the 1st of December, the Arab Higher Committee enacted a general strike that lasted 3 days. A wind of violence rapidly took hold of the country, foreboding civil war between the two communities. Murders, reprisals, and counter-reprisals came fast on each other's heels, resulting in dozens of victims killed on both sides in the process. The impasse persisted as British forces did not intervene to put a stop to the escalating cycles of violence. The first casualties after the adoption of Resolution 181 by the General Assembly were passengers on a Jewish bus driving on the coastal plain near Kfar Sirkin on the 30th of November. An 8-man gang from Jaffa ambushed the bus, killing 5 and wounding others. Half an hour later they ambushed a second bus, southbound from Hadera, killing 2 more. Arab snipers attacked Jewish buses in Jerusalem and Haifa. Ergun and Lehi followed their strategy of placing bombs in crowded markets and bus stops, as on the 30th of December in Haifa, when members of Ergun threw 2 bombs at a crowd of Arab workers who were queuing in front of a refinery, killing 6 of them and injuring 42. An angry crowd massacred 39 Jewish people in revenge, until British soldiers re-established calm. In reprisals, some soldiers from the strike force, Palmish and the Carmeli Brigade, attacked the village of Baladash Sheikh and Havasa. According to different historians, this attack led to between 21 and 70 deaths. According to Benny Morris, much of the fighting in the first months of the war took place in and on the edges of the main towns, and was initiated by the Arabs. It included Arab snipers firing at Jewish houses, pedestrians, and traffic, as well as planting bombs and mines along urban and rural paths and roads. From January onwards, operations became increasingly militarized. In all the mixed zones where both communities lived, particularly Jerusalem and Haifa, increasingly violent attacks, riots, reprisals and counter-reprisals followed each other. Isolated shootings evolved into all-out battles. Attacks against traffic, for instance, turned into ambushes as one bloody attack led to another. On the 22nd of February 1948, supporters of Muhammad Amin al-Husseini organized, with the help of certain British deserters, 3 attacks against the Jewish community, using car bombs aimed at the headquarters of the pro-Zionist Palestine Post newspaper, the Ben Yehuda Street Market and the backyard of the Jewish Agency offices. They killed 22, 53 and 13 Jewish people respectively, and injured hundreds. In revenge, Lehi put a landmine on the railroad track in Rehovot on which a train from Cairo to Haifa was traveling, killing 28 British soldiers and injuring 35. This would be copied on the 31st of March, close to Caesarea Maritima, which would lead to the death of 40 people, injuring 60, who were, for the most part, Arab civilians. Having recruited a few thousand volunteers, al-Husseini organized the blockade of the 100,000 Jewish residents of Jerusalem. To counter this, the Yishuv authorities tried to supply the city with convoys of up to 100 armored vehicles, but the operation became more and more impractical as the number of casualties in the relief convoys surged. By March, al-Husseini's tactic had paid off. Almost all of Haganah's armored vehicles had been destroyed, the blockade was in full operation, and hundreds of Haganah members who had tried to bring supplies into the city were killed. The situation for those who dwelt in the Jewish settlements in the highly isolated Negev and north of Galilee was even more critical, according to the Arab League General Safwat. Despite the fact that skirmishes and battles have begun, the Jews at this stage are still trying to contain the fighting to as narrow a sphere as possible in the hope that partition will be implemented, and a Jewish government formed. They hope that if the fighting remains limited, the Arabs will acquiesce in the fait accompli. This can be seen from the fact that the Jews have not so far attacked Arab villages unless the inhabitants of those villages attacked them or provoked them first. Although a certain level of doubt took hold among Yishuv supporters, their apparent defeats were due more to the wait-and-see policy than to weakness. David Ben-Gurion reorganized Haganah and made conscription obligatory. Every Jewish man and woman in the country had to receive military training. The powers' policies. This situation caused the U.S. to withdraw the support for the Partition Plan, thus encouraging the Arab League to believe that the Palestinian Arabs, reinforced by the Arab Liberation Army, could put an end to the plan for partition. The British, on the other hand, decided on the 7th of February 1948 to support the annexation of the Arab part of Palestine by Transjordan, the population suffering, while the Jewish population had received strict orders requiring them to hold the ground everywhere at all costs. The Arab population was more affected by the general conditions of insecurity to which the country was exposed. Up to 100,000 Arabs, from the urban upper and middle classes in Haifa, Jaffa and Jerusalem, or Jewish-dominated areas, evacuated abroad to Arab centers eastwards. Fighters in arms from abroad, thanks to funds raised by Golda Meir from sympathizers in the United States, and Stalin's decision to support the Zionist cause. The Jewish representatives of Palestine were able to sign very important armament contracts in the East. Other Haganah agents recuperated stockpiles from the Second World War, which helped them improve the army's equipment and logistics. Operation Balak allowed arms and other equipment to be transported for the first time by the end of March. There was an intervention of a number of Arab Liberation Army regiments inside Palestine, each active in a variety of distinct sectors around the different coastal towns. They consolidated the presence in Galilee and Samaria. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini came from Egypt with several hundred men of the Army of the Holy War. Death toll. Morris says that by the end of March 1948, the Yishuv had suffered about 1,000 dead. Ilan Pape estimates that 400 Jews and 1,500 Arabs were killed by January 1948. In December the Jewish death toll was estimated over 200 and, according to Alec Kirkbride, by the 18th of January 333 Jews and 345 Arabs were killed while 643 Jews and 877 Arabs were injured. The overall death toll between December 1947 and January 1948 was estimated at around 1,000. 2,000 people, with 2,000 injured. According to Yoav Gelber, by the end of March there was a total of 2,000 dead and 4,000 wounded. These figures correspond to an average of more than 100 deaths and 200 casualties per week in a population of 2 million. War of the Roads and blockade of Jerusalem. Geographic situation of the Jewish zones. Apart from on the coastline, Jewish yeshuvim, or settlements, were very dispersed. Communication between the coastal area, which was the most developed in terms of Jewish settlements, and the peripheral settlements was carried out by road links. These road links were an easy target for attacks, as the majority of them passed through or near entirely Arab localities. The isolation of the 100,000 Jewish people in Jerusalem and other Jewish settlements outside the coastal zone, such as Kibbutz Kfar, halfway on the strategic road between Jerusalem and Hebron. The 27 settlements in the southern region of Negev and the settlements to the north of Galilee were a weak strategic point for Yishuv. The possibility of evacuating these difficult-to-defend zones was considered, but the policy of Haganah was set by David Ben-Gurion. He stated that, "What the Jewish people have has to be concerned. No Jewish person should abandon his or her house, farm, kibbutz, or job without authorization. Every outpost, every colony, whether it is isolated or not, must be occupied as though it were Tel Aviv itself." No Jewish settlement was evacuated until the invasion of May 1948. Only a dozen kibbutzim in Galilee, as well as those of Gush Etzion, sent women and children into the safer interior zones. Ben-Gurion gave instructions that the settlements of Negev be reinforced in number of men and goods. In particular, the kibbutzim of Kfar Daram and Yad Mordechai, Revivim and Kfar Etzion. Conscious of the danger that weighed upon Negev, the Supreme Command of Haganah assigned a whole Palmash battalion there. Jerusalem and the great difficulty of accessing the city became even more critical to its Jewish population, who made up 1/6 of the total Jewish population in Palestine. The long and precipitous route from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, after leaving the Jewish zone at Huldah, went through the foothills of Latran. Then, the 28-kilometer route between Bab al-Wad and Jerusalem took no less than 3 hours, and the route passed the vicinity of the Arab villages of Saris, Glunia, Al-Kastel and Deir Yassin. Siege of Jerusalem. Abd al-Qadir al-Husseini arrived in Jerusalem with the intent to surround and besiege its Jewish community. He moved to Shurif, a village to the southwest of Jerusalem, with his supporters, around 100 fighters who were trained in Syria before the war and who served as officers in his army, Jihad al-Muqaddas, or Army of the Holy War. He was joined by hundreds of young villagers and Arab veterans of the British Army. His militia soon had several thousand men, and it moved its training quarters to Backlash, a town near Ramallah. Its zone of influence extended up to Lydda and Ramlah, where Hassan Salama, a veteran of the 1936 to 1939 Arab revolt in Palestine, commanded 1,000 men and coordinated, with al-Husseini, a plan of disruption and harassment of road traffic. On the 10th of December, the first organized attack occurred when 10 members of a convoy between Bethlehem and Kfar Etzion were killed. On the 14th of January, Abd al-Qadir himself commanded and took part in an attack against Kfar Etzion, in which 1,000 Palestinian Arab combatants were involved. The attack was a failure, and 200 of al-Husseini's men died. Nonetheless, the attack did not come without losses of Jewish lives. A detachment of 35 Palmash men who sought to reinforce the establishment were ambushed and killed. On the 25th of January, a Jewish convoy was attacked near the Arab village of Al-Kastel. The attack went badly, and several villages to the northeast of Jerusalem answered a call for assistance, although others did not, for fear of reprisals. The campaign for control over the roads became increasingly militaristic in nature and became a focal point of the Arab war effort. After the 22nd of March, supply convoys to Jerusalem stopped, due to a convoy of around 30 vehicles having been destroyed in the gorges of Bab el-Wad. On the 27th of March, an important supply convoy from Kfar was taken in an ambush in southern Jerusalem. They were forced to surrender all of their arms, ammunition and vehicles to al-Husseini's forces. The Jews of Jerusalem requested the assistance of the United Kingdom after 24 hours of combat. According to a British report, the situation in Jerusalem, where a food rationing system was already in application, risked becoming desperate after the 15th of May. The situation in other areas of the country was as critical as the one of Jerusalem. The settlements of Negev were utterly isolated, due to the impossibility of using the southern coastal road, which passed through zones densely populated by Arabs. On the 27th of March, a convoy of supplies that was intended for the isolated kibbutzim northwest of Galilee was attacked in the vicinity of Natharia. In the ensuing battle, 42 to 47 Haganah combatants and around 100 fighters of the Arab Liberation Army were killed, and all vehicles involved were destroyed. Death toll and analysis. In the last week of March alone, the losses sustained by Haganah were particularly heavy. They lost 3 large convoys in ambushes, more than 100 soldiers in the fleet of armored vehicles. All in all, West Jerusalem was gradually choked. The settlements of Galilee could not be reached in any other way but via the Valley of Jordan and the road of Natharia. This, along with the foreseen attack of the Arab states in May and the earlier projected departure date of the British, pushed Haganah to the offensive and to apply Plan.It from April onwards. Intervention of foreign forces in Palestine. Violence kept intensifying with the intervention of military units. Although responsible for law and order up until the end of the Mandate, the British did not try to take control of the situation, being more involved in the liquidation of the administration and the evacuation of the troops. Furthermore, the authorities felt that they had lost enough men already in the conflict. The British either could not or did not want to impede the intervention of foreign forces into Palestine. According to a special report by the UN Special Commission on Palestine, during the night of 2021 January, a troop composed of 700 Syrians in battle dress, equipped well and in control of mechanized transport, enters Palestine via Transjordan. On the 27th of January, a band of 300 men from outside Palestine was established in the area of safety in Galilee and was probably responsible for the intensive heavy weapon and mortar attacks the following week against the settlement of Yetziim. In the night of 29-30 January, a battalion commanded by Fawzi al-Kawakji that consisted of 950 men in 19 vehicles was deployed by the Arab Liberation Army and entered Palestine via Adam Bridge and dispersed itself around the villages of Nablus, Jenin and Tulkarim. This description corresponds to the entry of Arab Liberation Army troops between the 10th of January and the start of March. The 2nd Regiment of Yarmouk, under the orders of Adib Shishaklai, entered Galilee via Lebanon on the night of 11-12 January. The battalion passed through Safed and then settled in the village of Sassa. A third of the regiment's fighters were Palestinian Arab, and a quarter were Syrian. The 1st Yarmouk Regiment, commanded by Muhammad Zafar, entered Palestine on the night of 21 January, via the Bridge of Damia from Jordan, and dispersed forces around Samaria, where it established its HQ, in the northern Samarian city of Tubiz. The regiment is composed chiefly of Palestinian Arabs and Iraqis. The Hiton Regiment, commanded by Madlal Abbas, settled in the west of Samaria with its headquarters in Tulkarim. The Hussein ibn Ali Regiment provided reinforcement in Haifa, Jaffa, Jerusalem and several other cities. The Qadasiyah Regiment were reserves based in Jabbar. Fawzi al-Kawakji, field commander of the Arab Liberation Army, arrived, according to himself, on the 4th of March, with the rest of the logistics and around 100 Bosniak volunteers in Jabbar, a small village on the route between Nablus and Jenin. He established a headquarters there and a training center for Palestinian Arab volunteers. Alan Cunningham, the British High Commissioner in Palestine, thoroughly protested against the incursions and the fact that no serious effort is being made to stop incursions. The only reaction came from Alec Kirkbride, who complained to Ernest Bevan about Cunningham's hostile tone and threats. The British and the Information Service of Yeshav expected an offensive for the 15th of February, but it would not take place, seemingly because the Mufti troops were not ready. In March, an Iraqi regiment of the Arab Liberation Army came to reinforce the Palestinian Arab troops of Salameh in the area around Lida and Ramla, while al-Husseini started a headquarters in Backlash, 10 kilometers to the north of Ramallah. At the same time, a number of North African troops, principally Libyans, and hundreds of members of the Muslim Brotherhood entered Palestine. In March, an initial regiment arrived in Gaza and certain militants among them reached Jaffa. Morale of the fighters. The Arab combatants' initial victories reinforced morale among them. The Arab Higher Committee was confident and decided to prevent the setup of the UN-backed Partition Plan. In an announcement made to the Secretary-General on the 6th of February, they declared, "At the beginning of February 1948, the morale of the Jewish leaders was not high. Distress and despair arose clearly from the notes taken at the meetings of the Mapai Party. The attacks against the Jewish settlements and main roads worsened the direction of the Jewish people, who underestimated the intensity of the Arab reaction. The situation of the 100,000 Jews situated in Jerusalem was precarious, and supplies to the city, already slim in number, were likely to be stopped. Nonetheless, despite the setbacks suffered, the Jewish forces, in particular Haganah, remained superior in number and quality to those of the Arab forces. The first wave of Palestinian refugees. The high morale of the Arab fighters and politicians was not shared by the Palestinian Arab civilian population. The UN Palestine Commission reported panic continues to increase, however, throughout the Arab middle classes, and there is a steady exodus of those who can afford to leave the country. From December 1947 to January 1948, around 70,000 Arabs fled, and, by the end of March, that number had grown to around 100,000. These people were part of the first wave of Palestinian refugees of the conflict. Mostly the middle and upper classes fled, including the majority of the families of local governors and representatives of the Arab Higher Committee. Non-Palestinian Arabs also fled in large numbers. Most of them did not abandon the hope of returning to Palestine once the hostilities had ended.